One. And I'd like to welcome you to the St. Genevieve Fall History Conference, sponsored by the Foundation for Restoration of St. Genevieve. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being here. It shows that you're interested in preservation. You know, when we think of preservation, a lot of us, we think of buildings, but there's more than that. And as we'll see and hear today, you know, it's the stories. And the stories are what's kind of have grabbed me. You know, there's so many stories coming out of this area. And again, there's going to be 5 new stories today that we can look forward to. So again, I want to welcome you. And it takes people like you to preserve. And also, while we're talking about preservation, it takes also people like Dr. Margaret Kimball Brown. She worked in archaeology and preservation for over 50 years, and she's a past speaker here at the conference. I know a number of you knew Margaret a lot better than I did. I met her a couple of times. One time I was sitting next to her at an event, and we introduced ourselves, and I go, "Oh, the Kaskaskia manuscripts," because I just love the Kaskaskia manuscripts. And she goes, "Oh no, that was Laura Dean." And I said, well, your name was on it. Surely you had something to do with it. But she just seemed to be that kind of a person. She wasn't, into taking the credit. So, recently Margaret passed away after a long 88 years, which is wonderful. But in her honor, if we wouldn't mind, we'll have a moment of silence, please, for a great preservationist before we get started with the conference. So if you would please acknowledge a moment of silence, please, with us. Okay, thank you. And I thank Margaret Brown, because I refer to that history, the Kaskaskia manuscripts, often. Dr. Will Thompson is Director of the International and Global Studies Program at the University of Memphis, where he is also the Associate Professor of French and Undergraduate Coordinator in the Department of World Languages and Literatures. He is originally from Canada, where he obtained his Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts at McMaster University before completing his PhD at Cornell University. He currently serves as President-elect of the American Association of Teachers of French and the Vice President of the Center for French Colonial Studies. He has been recognized for his contributions to the promotion of language learning by the Tennessee World Language Teaching Association, which awarded him the Jacqueline Elliott Award for Service in Higher Education, and by the French Ministry of Education, which named him a Chevalier of the Order of the Palms in Academia. There's a French term for that, and I would hope that I tried to Google and listen, and I couldn't. So please, because I'm interested in how you do that. His research focuses on early portrayals of French communities in the American Midwest in the 18th and 19th centuries. Please welcome Dr. Will Thompson, who will present Jean Boullier, The Life of a French Priest in 19th Century Missouri.
I'm really delighted to be presenting again at the History Conference. I have a few thank yous. First of all, thank you to the Foundation for organizing this event. Thank you to Bob for inviting me to be one of the speakers. I'm very honored. I also must thank the people at the archives of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, because much of what I'm presenting is based on information that they were able to provide me both virtually and when I went to visit there last month. I'd also have to thank, because I'm required to, the University of Memphis Division of Research and Innovation, because they provided me with a fieldwork and archival research grant to go to St. Louis and visit the archives of the Archdiocese. So I'm very grateful for that financial support. And I also want to thank my good friend Kent Bone, with whom I've collaborated on so many things having to do with old mines, and who has also provided me with some of the correspondence that I'll be talking about through copies that he has and conversations that we've had about Jean Boullier over the years, and which has always been a pleasure for me. So, there we go. All right, I'm going to give you a bit of a geographical context and historical context before we go on to the life of Jean Boullier and his correspondence, which gives us a very nice idea of what it was like for a Catholic priest to be located in Missouri in the early 19th century. So you can see there's St. Louis. If you go south of St. Louis, you probably all know where you are right now. So there's St. Genevieve. And if you go just, there we are. And if you look over here, you will see Old Mines. And that is where St. Joachim Catholic Church is located. And that is the church that Jean Boullier spent most of his time at in the period that he was located in Missouri. Okay, next slide. And here's an older map. This is actually from well before the time that I'm going to be discussing, but I've always liked this map. You can see it's in French, the Pays des Illinois. And this is even before St. Genevieve exists. So there's Kaskaskia, there's Cahokia, and then you see just randomly placed, actually, mines. And the mines are important for understanding why there was a church at Old Mines and why Boullier ended up being there. Next slide. So just a little bit of the background of the history. So when did the French first become aware there were mines? And mines of what? They were looking for silver and gold. Who wouldn't? Precious jewels would have been very nice, but in fact they found lead, which was useful to the French in the early 18th century for a variety of purposes. So around 1700, we know already through a priest in his writings just being told by the French who were taking him down the Mississippi that if you went up the Merrimack, you would find lead mines. And they already knew how good the quality was, meaning that there were already French exploring the area, getting the lead, and experimenting with it to see whether or not it would be useful, which it was. So that's happening in 1700 already. But it's not until 1723, and last year, many of you might have known that Old Mines celebrated its 300th anniversary, so it's probably one of many 300th anniversaries it actually has. But this is in fact the first written document where Philippe Renaud, who had come from France to conduct mining operations, he officially receives the land grant that he had been promised, giving him several parcels of land, one north of Fort de Chartres. The community was called Saint-Philippe, as well as a parcel of land which is more or less where Old Mines is today. And so he began conducting mining operations then. So that's why the French are there in Old Mines. The mining operations went on fairly regularly through the 18th century, but we don't have a lot of information as to people living there. For the most part, it was seasonal mining. The people there were in St. Genevieve and in Kaskaskia and would go to Old Mines to conduct mining. So they were living there. They couldn't just, you just didn't go for the day. It was hard to get there. It was a long trip and you wanted to stay there. So there must have been some kind of community. There is reference to cabanage, meaning some kind of structure, cabin-like structure that was there. But in fact, it would not necessarily have been regular habitation, and so there was no church, there was no priest at the time through the 18th century. There is a reference, and I've got to work somehow to find out who this guy was, who was a Spanish priest who wrote that he visited the mines in the late 18th century, but that's all I have. I have this one little sentence that somebody borrowed from somebody, and the name is not clear, but I thought I'd put that in there. So the Vincentians arrived because there's acknowledgement that the Midwest of the United States needs Catholic priests. There are very, very few, and there's a large Catholic population, not only French-speaking, but other nationalities as well, and the Midwest needs priests. So the Vincentians in 1818 established St. Mary's of the Barons, so there is a seminary. They are bringing men from France and Italy. In the case of Boullier, he is already a priest when he leaves France, but then he receives training because they are missionaries. That, not necessarily in the sense of going out and converting the Native American populations they encounter, but just serving the communities without necessarily being connected to a parish, serving the Catholic communities of the region. One connection to St. Genevieve that I will mention again. In the 1820s, the Old Mines community is asking for a priest. They don't have one, but Henri Platt, who is the priest in St. Genevieve, goes to the mines, as he writes, to serve the community, as does his successor, Father Dahmen, in the late 1820s until Boullier arrives. In 1827, Joseph Rosati becomes Bishop of St. Louis. This is key because most of Boulier's correspondence is with Bishop Rosati, because he's always asking him for stuff. So Boullier, I'll give you more details on his biography shortly, but he becomes the first parish priest at St. Joachim in Old Mines in 1828. There is a log church there. We do not know what it looks like. We don't, it probably may look like the church in Cahokia, but I don't think there's even a knowledge of exactly where it was. It was probably on the grounds where the church is today, but we don't have any information about that. It probably was not it was probably a rudimentary structure. But after Boullier arrives, construction does begin on the church that is there today. Although we'll see later, it did not look like what it looks like today when it was first built. And it was consecrated in 1831 and has been continuously the parish church for the community since then. Yes?
Is Father Boullier a Vincentian then?
Yes, he is.
And what about Father Pratt? What, I mean, they both are...
No, he would not have, because he was there before.
He was they're both subject to the bishop in St. Louis?
Well, I think he would have been.
Is his diocese or...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's complicated with Rossetti because for a time he was the bishop of basically the entire Midwest, which he did not want to be, from what I can tell, because it was too much work. But Pratt was not Vincentian.
He was actually educated in Canada, the first
Right.
native-born priest west of the Mississippi.
Right.
From here.
Thank you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And just to give you an idea of how much this history is still visible today, this is the old cemetery in Old Mines. You can see there are some more traditional tombstones, but there are also many iron crosses that were used as grave markers. And there are actually 3 cemeteries at St. Joachim, which are all very beautiful, very interesting to visit from a historical perspective and understanding the French populations there. Okay, next slide. So Jean Boullier. So he is born in Rouen, France, which is just west of Lyon, so sort of east central modern France. He's born there in 1801. He enters the seminary in Lyon in 1821. He is ordained and tonsured in 1822. I had to, tonsuring was, you kind of think of the monks who have their heads completely shaved and except on the side. Probably by this time that it wasn't a complete shaving. There was probably more a ceremonial cutting of hair, I believe. But anyway, we do have the documents, the 2 documents, one saying he's ordained and one saying that he is tonsured. And then he's recruited by Dubourg, which may be a name that if you're from St. Genevieve, you're familiar with, to come. He is among a group of men that are recruited to come to North America to serve in the missions. And he arrives in 1825 in Perryville. And then, as I already mentioned, 1828, he comes to St. Joachim to serve as the parish priest. We'll talk about why he leaves for a while in 1831. Then he leaves St. Joachim in, as far as we can tell by the written record, 1837. If you move to the next slide, this is the Archdiocese record of his employment. So you can see in 1828, 1825, I think that is, he's arriving in the Barrens. He's in the Barrens, then he's at Old Mines. And then from 1839 to 1847, it's just not giving. Like, I don't know if they didn't know where he was or he was no longer in the area. In fact, but there seems to be some reference to him in 1849 being in Cape Girardeau. But after that, I've not done enough research to find out what actually happens to him in the end. But for our purposes today, the period from 1828 to 1837, when he is in Old Mines, is the most important period. Next slide. So this is actually an interesting document. This is the Archbishop of Lyon giving him permission to travel to Louisiana. Don't worry about seeing the document, especially towards the back. It's in French with some Latin thrown in, and I'll give you the essentials. But what's interesting is the Archbishop is saying, he has my permission to go and serve in the Mission Étrangère, the foreign missions. But if it turns out that he does not really have a calling to do this, or he can't persevere, that's the verb in French that's used, he has to come back. He has to come back to Lyon. And he can't do anything else while he's there. He has to work for the foreign missions, and he can't work for anybody else. Because if we find out that he has to come back. So there were conditions imposed on his traveling to North America, to Louisiana, as the message says. And in fact, he did respect that. So what was his life like? Here is an example. It's hard to read even in the original. He had a lot of baptisms, first communions, marriages, and funerals. Not surprising. That was the work of the parish priest. And tending to the sick, visiting those who might be dying. And so this is just a typical document that I chose somewhat randomly, showing the marriage in 1835, I think it is. It's a bit hard to read. So after he's been there for a while, just saying that he is, according to the rites of the Catholic Church, and a publication of the banns. You had to publish them 3 times. This couple got dispensation they just had to do it once. Which is not uncommon because they are a ways away from everybody else, so let's just publish it once and be done with it. But some of the information provided is interesting. So who's getting married? It's Eugène Frédéric Saucier, a native of St. Louis, who is the legitimate son. So the priest is it's like, this is a good guy. He's legitimate. We'll see later there's some questionable characters in the communities. So he's the legitimate son of the late François Saucier and Marie-Françoise Nicole Lesbois, his widow. And then he is marrying Pélagie Roussin, who is a native of St. Genevieve. She is the legitimate daughter of Étienne Roussin and Aspasie Vallée. And I have given them the nuptial benediction, that's a literal translation, in front of the témoins, the witnesses, that being Charles Roussin, Napoléon Aubuchon, can't get a more French name than that, who signed with us, as well as the parents of the bride and the contracting parties, meaning the groom and the bride also signed. So very typical. It was formulaic. There weren't many variations on this kind of document. Next slide. So I'm so happy for whoever it was back in time who transcribed these, so I didn't have to read the original French writing. But these are just in the register at St. Mary's Seminary. We have some of the baptismal records here. The first one I found interesting. I mentioned this to some people last night. So in 1828, as the curé, as the priest of this parish, I baptized under condition Louis Toussaint Sans Souci. Very old mind's name. What was the condition? Well, Louis was already 8 years old. So from what I can understand, and my apologies, I'm not Catholic, I'm not a priest, and so I may not understand everything that was happening back then. But it was probably that sometimes if the child was older, it was under a condition because there was the possibility the child had already been baptized and the parents maybe weren't sure. I don't know how that happens, but there was a condition put on it because the priest had reasonably, well, you can't baptize them twice, so maybe if we say sous condition, that makes it just in case. But the weird thing about Louis is not this condition, but the fact that he's the half-legitimate son of Baptiste Sans Souci and Marguerite Lemay. I'm not sure what half a legitimate son is. So maybe they had the kid and then they got married, or I'm not. I've looked and looked. I can't find any explanation for this term, but it's there. It's in the written record, so they have to deal with it. But just sometimes reading these records, you just come across this little extra word or phrase that gets you thinking about what was going on. Next slide, please. But in many ways, what's very interesting about Boulier's letters is he's describing old mines. He's describing the people of old mines and what the conditions are like. So this is in letter that he sent to Bishop Rosati. So you can see it begin. I cut off the top, but it's Monseigneur. In accordance with your orders, I'm sending you the result of the information you want concerning the founding and present population of the area. So he says Old Mines is established in 1801. although they've already been mining there for some 60, it was actually more, but he says 60 years. And he mentions that the Creole families have come to establish themselves and to remain there. And he's writing in 1831, so it's a very well-established community now. He also mentions that the Creoles, many of the French had been mining there, but had been living in Mina Breton, which is now Potosi, and then had moved back to that's why it's the old mines, in the late 18th, early 19th century. But he does say that before 1801, there were camps of miners. So again, people were kind of living seasonally at the mines. When the weather was good, they would be, he used the word excavating, and then they would return to St. Genevieve or Kaskaskia to live the rest of the time. Next slide. In this same letter, he talks about the fact that Monsieur Pratt, the pastor of St. Genevieve, would come to visit them. He started doing that in 1816 and actually celebrated Mass. It was probably done in somebody's home. Boullier himself would go to Richwood or Potosi, and before they had churches, he would be at somebody's house, staying at the house and also celebrating Mass there. And then he says that Pratt continued to visit until 1820, at which point a small log chapel was constructed. Boullier can't always be believed when he cites years, but we do have his statement saying there was some kind of chapel there before the present day church. And now they have built, in 1831, when he is writing, they have started a new brick church, which they are building with zeal and ardor, both. And 1831, the church is consecrated, but we can tell he's writing before that because he's can't wait to say Mass there continuously. He says incessantly, which sounds like he's only saying Mass all the time, but basically meaning now we have a permanent place at which we can say Mass, and that at Mina Breton, they're also building a church because he would be the parish priest for Old Mines, for St. James in Potosi, and for the St. Stephen's in Richwoods. Next slide. So he had his sort of daily routine, weekly routine, but there were issues he confronted, largely the result of a lack of a regular priest being present over time. And he writes to Bishop Rosati about a case, and he says that you already know about. And one of the issues was if there wasn't a priest, well, they could go to the justice of the peace. They could go to a juge and get married. And of course, no, you're Catholic. You're not supposed to do that. That's not a good marriage. And so he writes on several occasions about these marriages that have to be, and the French word is great, they have to be rehabilitated. It's a bad marriage. So we've got to make it right. Or, worst case scenario, refuse and ban those people from receiving Mass. So he writes about Madame Portel, who has married for the second time. She's a widow, so she's married for the second time, and she's married a Canadian. So that's okay, because by Canadien, she means a French-speaking Canadian who would be Catholic, so that was okay. But Rosati has refused to ratify the marriage. And the reason why is the Canadien, the man from Canada, has to prove that he doesn't have a wife back in Canada. And until that is proven, which he managed to do, the bishop refuses to allow this marriage to be considered a good Catholic marriage. So it just says un Canadien.
Doesn't give a name?
Yeah, in this it does not mention his name. We could probably find it, but it's not mentioned in the letter. But they managed to have, there's somebody who's going up to Montreal who's going to go and find out whether this guy is married up there, and then he's going to come back. But what I found really interesting about this letter, he says, while we're waiting, I have told them to separate, to not live together, until we get your letter from Rosati saying that it's okay, to which they have submitted voluntarily, which makes me think that their intentions are not entirely bad. So I thought that's particular. But there were other cases of bad marriages. Next slide. And so he has to write to Rosati about two. I've found two cases of people who are married in front of a judge with non-baptized people. So they've married somebody who's not baptized in the Catholic Church, and they're married in front of a judge. And so that's horrible. What am I supposed to do? He says, he writes to Rosati, si vous le jugez à propos, if you think it's okay, please send me as soon as possible the necessary powers, meaning he just has to write something saying you can do this, to rehabilitate these marriages. Okay. Next slide. The French, what did the French like to do? They like to dance, and they like to play games, and this was a big issue for Boullier. He says, I have two topics to talk to you about. The first is the bal, the dances, and the second is the cantine, he calls them, or cabaret, which are basically gaming halls. And he says the first are very frequent in this area, so much so that I have not dared to forbid them, because he's not going to get along with the French if he tells them you can't have any fun. So what he says, I've gone so far as to forbid certain forms of dancing that are worse than the others. I need a dance historian to tell me what kind of dancing was common among popular folk in the early 19th century and which were worse than others, because apparently some were. Yeah, sort of like, is it like at the school dances where you have to stay so far apart? I'm imagining maybe it's something like that. No grinding. And he says, as far as the second are concerned, and this is the cabaret, he says this is so damaging because these poor men, malheureux, these unfortunate, these poor men go there, they get drunk, they ruin their families, they damage their health, and they are losing their souls. Okay, a lot's going on, obviously. That's what's happening in this country, ce pays, the mining country. And he's like, can we let these people take the sacraments? And it's like they're sinning as far as I can tell, and I can't forbid them from doing that because I'll look really bad, but am I allowed to offer them the sacraments? And he ends the letter by saying, you have given me a charge, you've given me responsibilities far above my strengths. He said, I can't handle this. It's basically what he is saying. Next slide. Oh, this is one of his main concerns when he's the early priest is building the church. And sometimes in a lot of documents you'll see the priest built a church. Well, the priest didn't build the church. He got the work done. And he has some issues. So this is a rendition by Kent Bone of what the original structure might have looked like. Today it is much longer. It has a full steeple. There's a vestibule. but this is an approximation of the size and what it might have looked like. Not a very complicated structure when it was built. Next slide. So he says, my church isn't finished. He calls it my church. He says, my church isn't finished yet. And one of the problems is that his worker is working really slow because his worker thinks his worker has heard that bricklayers in St. Louis make a lot more money than him, and therefore, why should he be working so hard? And so he asked Rossetti, can you send me something, just write something saying that, no, they don't make more in St. Louis, and maybe he'll work faster. But these are the trials and tribulations of the small parish priest. So sadly, his church is finished and consecrated in 1831, and he's not there. He's still the parish priest, but he has been, he's absent. He's not mentioned in all the documents about who was there when the church was consecrated. Rossetti came from St. Louis, excuse me. So he was there, and a bunch of other people were there. Undoubtedly, some of the Vincentians from Perryville had come up because it was a big deal. It was one of the earliest churches in the area to be consecrated. But he's not there because his father has died, and he's the oldest son, and he must return to France to settle the estate, to settle his inheritance. And it's a problem because he's supposed to be accompanying these two young men, ces deux jeunes gens, whose names are Hilary and Georges. We don't have any, doesn't say anything else about them, who are supposed to be going to Italy. And so Boullier, not only is he wanting to go back to Europe, if he's going to Lyon, he's going through the Mediterranean to Marseille, but he's also hoping during the trip to go to Rome, because, what Catholic priest wouldn't want to go to Rome if he had the opportunity? Well, imagine in this early 19th century, it's not an easy task to get from Old Mines to Marseille, to Lyon, maybe to Rome as well, and then come back. So he is actually gone, he says, I'll be gone about 8 to 10 months, which was in fact the case. He is unable, however, to go to Italy because there's a civil war going on in 1831 there. That's why he sent the two young men back up, because they were going to Italy. Now they can't. They think it's dangerous. So the news has traveled to the Midwest that there are political problems and violence. So he is not going to go he's not going to be able to go to see the Pope or whatever he expected to do. Next slide. This is how you end a letter in French. You just can't say sincerely in French. That does not work, even in modern times. So, and he's going for a long time. It may be a difficult journey. No, it's not as bad as it maybe was in the early 18th century, but it's still a major undertaking for somebody to go from Old Mines to New Orleans, wait for a boat, get over there, do what you have to do over there, and get on another boat and come back, and then find a boat to get back up the Mississippi River. So he writes a very elaborate, in French it's called a formule. This is a formule de politesse. How you end a letter. It's this form of politeness. And he says, Monseigneur, I'm throwing myself at your knees, asking you for your last benediction and asking you to remember me in your holy, your saint sacrifice, in your prayers, I imagine. And I also ask my confrère, my fellow priest in St. Louis, to not forget me in their prayers. And then the formule is, please accept, Monseigneur, the assurance of profound respect and consideration with which I am your very unworthy priest and obeying servant. That's how you suck up to the bishop in French. But it also shows his concern. He says, I'm going to be gone for a long time, and you've allowed me to do this. He had to get permission from Rosati to do this. And so he's going to put a lot into it. However, while he's away, there's a conspiracy. Because as I mentioned earlier, from what I understand, the Vincentians, the foreign missions priests, weren't necessarily intended to be parish priests. That's what they ended up being because there was such a need for them. But they weren't supposed to be on their own serving communities, and especially Boullier, he wasn't just Old Mines, but he was also Richwoods, he was also Potosi, and there was a little bit of an issue there because he was French, but he had limited English skills. And Potosi and Richwoods were much more English-speaking than Old Mines by this point. So the parishioners of Old Mines, Potosi, and Richwoods, and this is in English, write to the bishop saying, we need an English-speaking priest. And there is one, because at this point, Boullier is no longer alone. Father Bournia has come to Old Mines to serve as well, and so they are serving together. And it's not clear that Bournia is supposed to be there long term, so the parishioners, especially the English-speaking parishioners, write and say, please let Father Bournia stay because we need an English-speaking priest. We don't all speak French, and this would be, and Father Bournia has been very good, helping Father Boullier, so please let him stay. Boullier doesn't know this is going on, and he sees it as being instigated by Bournia so that Bournia can push him out of the way. So Boullier gets back to North America and says, I've been at the mine for 2 weeks. These 2 weeks have been for me two weeks of bother, pain, and sorrow. And so Bishop Rosati has written back to the English-speaking inhabitants of the area, of what now Washington County, and said, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Bournia can stay. And Boullier is not happy at all because Boullier hates Father Bournia. There's no ambiguity about it whatsoever. He does not like Father Bournia. And so he's not mad because he feels like he can't serve his people. He feels like he's mad because they maybe like Father Bournia more than they like him. But the two do not get along. In other letters, Boullier does accuse Bournia of misappropriating funds or using church money for purposes that are not appropriate. But he's mad in particular because Bishop Rosati's letter to the inhabitants suggests that Father Bournia has told Rosati that he and Boullier have agreed that this is the way it's going to work. And Boullier so Boullier refers to the positive assurance from Father Bournia that this is a affaire convenue, that we have agreed on this, that we will both remain here together, and this never took place. So he's mad. He's really mad. He's mad at Bournia. He's mad at Rosati now. And he has to do this other falling at his knees because he's like, sorry, I'm getting harsh, but I'm mad. And so he ends the letter with this very interesting request, not to get rid of Bournia, not to intercede again. He says, so I hope that you will approve the desire that I have to return to New Orleans and that you will not refuse me permission to do so. And this becomes a recurring theme for Boullier. Virtually all of his letters end by, I need to go to New Orleans. And he keeps saying, I need to go to New Orleans. So yeah, the priestly hostilities are continuing. And he says, I'm fine to stay at the mine, à la mine, you can see in the second line, only if, and he doesn't even write his name anymore, he says M.B., Monsieur B. Bournia, as long as M.B. no longer, and the expression in French is beautiful, ni met plus les pieds, no longer puts his feet there. So as long as Boullier never comes back, I will stay at the mine. So it's really bad. Like I'm not even going to write his name anymore. He's that mad. Okay. And he ends by saying, if Boullier stays, I can no longer live here happy and content. Heureux et content. So it's bad. So when 1836, 1837, things are winding down, he's pretty happy to be leaving and be replaced. Next slide. Oh yeah, and this one's great. Just a little trip to New Orleans, just a little bit. So if you permit me, I will make another un petit voyage, a little trip. Yeah, there were no planes. There's no speedboats. It took a long time to get there and come back because he says, oh, I have some affairs there. What affairs does a priest have in New Orleans who's never lived there? He brings this up from time to time, and then he says, after that, I will irrevocablement come back to Missouri. That's why we're kind of thinking that after 1837, all of a sudden he disappears, is that he takes a trip to New Orleans, and there is one letter from Rossetti saying, I never gave you permission to go to New Orleans, because apparently he went once and didn't. He thought, oh, I thought you got my letter, and no, that never happened. But anyway, so this kind of precipitates his departure. But some of the things he was trying to do, he did try to establish a school for girls while it was in 1833. After the church was finished and consecrated, he comes back from France in late 1832, and he wants to have a school for girls. Because he says they have no French school to go to, and for English there was an Irishman, so at least there was an Irishman, meaning Catholic, who would give them some education, who was a good teacher. But, next slide, the Protestants have plotted together. There's been a cabal. And they've built a Protestant school so that the Irish guy was forced to leave. Like, Irish guy couldn't teach them because now there's a Protestant public school. And so I immediately rushed forward to prevent the girls from going to the new school because they'd be corrupted permanently if they did, promising that we would soon have a school for them. And it's several years long after Boullier, when we finally have Madame Lamarck contributes the funds to build the first school in Old Mines. But this was a problem because the French are becoming the minority, the Protestants are establishing themselves and becoming more prominent in government, in education, and what are the poor Catholics supposed to do? Other issues that he faced, apart from his disagreements with his fellow priests, old mines, small population, so after a while you get people who are kind of closely related who want to get married. And you have to, and there are several levels of consanguinité. I can't even say it in English. I can say it better in French. Consanguinity? Anyway, that means you're related by blood. And there are various levels, from, some you can't get married. You can't be married if, you're siblings. Then there's first cousins, and so on and so forth. So I think there are like 5 levels. And if you're if you're at level 1 or 2, level 1 you can't, but level 2, which is basically cousins, and second cousins, level 3, you have to get permission from the archbishop to do so. So he says, he's writing to Rossetti saying, would you please allow these 2 people to get united in marriage. One is Jean-Baptiste Prat, the other is Aphasie Duclos. So if you're a Prat or Duclos, sorry if I'm talking about your ancestors. He said, and he kind of works around saying they're cousins. He says, they are second-degree relatives, being that they are the children of 2 sisters. So they're cousins. But he doesn't say cousins, but he's trying to maybe soften the blow a little bit. And he says, please allow this to happen because they really want to get married. And they're just going to go to a judge and get married if we do not allow them to get married. So it's actually better for them to be married by the church, even though they're cousins, than for them to bypass the church and just go to a justice of the priest. And he says, oh, yeah, and they're very poor. So maybe that just makes it okay, I guess. And one last one, yeah, there were outbreaks of cholera as well. He mentions in a couple of letters, this is one where he describes it, where there have been 11, there have been 11 morts, there have been 11 deaths, and he's been spending all of his time tending to those who are sick. He says, I'm on my feet day and night, and that it's also been declared in Richwood and in Mina Breton. And so just one of the other things that he's having to deal with during this time. So that gives you some perspective on the life of Father Boullier. I want to end with just a few sound bites from Bishop Rosati, though, because I found these when I was doing my research in St. Louis, and they were so interesting. Even though they don't all relate directly to Father Boullier. On the left you have, this is the entrance to the crypt where Bishop Rosati, in the old cathedral in St. Louis, where Bishop Rosati is entombed. So yeah, just a few points. What do you need in early Missouri? I'm sending you a barrel of wine, 1 of sugar, a sack of coffee, and some mosquito netting. These are mentioned so frequently because somebody's writing, it's like, the guy who's bringing you this letter is also bringing you this. And those few things appear all the time. Yeah, go forward and to the next one. The do's and don'ts of Bishop Rosati. Don't ask me for a coffee pot. I'm not sure why. Apparently he's like, people keep asking me for coffee. I'm sending you coffee, I'm not sending you the pot. It's very strange. Don't offer communion to a Freemason. You may, this one confuses me slightly. You may remain in St. Louis, don't buy any fish. That was it. They didn't explain why. Maybe, I don't know, the fish was bad or we already have fish, but anyway. Don't forget to send the holy oils. This comes up frequently. Holy oils, can you send me some holy books? Boullier writes that. Send me some holy stones. I'm not sure what those are, but yeah, these things come up all the time. They want the bishop to do whatever and make something holy for their use. And then you are perfectly correct to refuse to ring the bell for someone who has died but who never came to church. No, we're not going to do that. I don't care how nice he was. We're not doing it if they didn't come to church. And the next, Father Niel is useless. Rosati did not mince words. You could tell over time he just gets a little bit cranky because these priests are writing to him, they're asking for stuff. He doesn't have what they need. But people aren't getting along, and some are just useless. The next one. And 2 in French, just because his French is beautiful. He actually, we need somebody Italian-speaking to read his voluminous correspondence to his brother, which is all in Italian. It looks very interesting. My language skills are not strong enough to allow me to interpret the Italian, but he writes very long letters to his brother, which I think maybe contains more insight into life among the priesthood in Missouri. So I'm sending you Henri Blair. So Henri Blair had come to Perryville, had come to the Barrens to train as a priest. He has neither the taste or the ecclesiastical state. So he's not going to be a priest. He's just not made for the priesthood. He's even less suited for studying. So he got there and was like, I don't want to study. And they're like, okay, you can't be a priest. But you might be good enough to work in a store. So I'm sending him to New Orleans. We just need to get rid of him. We don't need him up here. Find something for him to do. And then Mr. Piombino has signed an affidavit before a justice of the peace declaring that this is one of these guys who wanted to get married but had been married somewhere else, and he says, my wife died, and they're like, prove it. And so he couldn't, so he signed an affidavit, or he made a serment. He declared before Justice of the Peace saying, as his wife is dead, it's necessary that he be allowed to get married. But then he adds at the end, if he wants to. Which I thought was a very interesting little statement. It's like, if he really wants to get married, let him. So I'll conclude with this slide. This is St. Joachim Church in Old Mines. If you've never been to Old Mines to see the church, it's a beautiful structure. It has been consecrated in 1831. It has been expanded upon. You can see the new school there to the right. The Madame Lamarck School, which dates from the 1850s, I believe, is behind the church and next to it, and it has been restored. Actually, for various events in the last year, with the 300th anniversary, Kent Bone and myself organized a small historical exhibit that was on display there. He did it again last weekend for their annual fall festival. So it's just a beautiful place to visit. You may drive by it on Highway 21 not even knowing what the history is, but it's a fascinating history, and hopefully they've shared a little piece of that history with you that you find interesting. Thank you very much.
French population in this time?
That's a very good question. In Old Mines, I think by the time Boullier is there would have been a few hundred families, he says. There were also French people in Richwood and in Potosi, of course in St. Genevieve, probably still in Kaskaskia, small population in Kaskaskia, in Prairie de Rocher, in Cahokia, obviously St. Louis, but it's very hard. As the 19th century progresses, there's more assimilation and of the population, and it gets more difficult to say exactly what the population is. But it was considerable. But at the end of the 18th century, still French was the dominant language and cultural practices of the region. Yes? No, Baldwin is the first main German immigration to this area.
It started in 1832.
Okay. Yeah, so the French are here much long before. When the joke is kind of like when Thomas Jefferson says, let's explore this vast new Louisiana territory that we have acquired, and the French were like, we've already done it. We're here. We've already done all this stuff. You just don't speak French and understand. Yes.
Boullier is a Vincentian,
Yes.
but I mean, does he have any reporting obligations to the Vincentians, or is everything through the diocesan bishop in St. Louis?
I see most of the correspondence I've seen, which I think is most that's available, is his writing to Bishop Rosati. Now, so the Archdiocese Archives in St. Louis has his correspondence. Notre Dame University, which is the repository of much of the Catholic history of the United States, they have some correspondence of his. And then DePaul University, because it was St. Vincent de Paul, also has some information. So I've still yet to explore those. Most of what I've seen and all the letters that I've been able to identify, even if I haven't read them yet, almost all of them are from Boullier to Rosati.
Well, Rosati would be in charge of the Catholic churches. And
Yes.
So it'd have to be through him.
Yes.
You couldn't get permission for the Vincentians to do anything.
Yeah, well, I just wondered because I haven't seen any correspondence. He might have. There is one early letter of his that we cannot tell who it was written to. It was to Monsieur, but it wasn't to Rosati, and it's the one where he describes in great detail Old Mines. And he says, I'm here to devote myself to the mines, and he gives this person a description which indicates that this person is somewhere else. So it's not Rosati, it's not one of his fellow priests, but we don't know exactly to whom he wrote this letter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.